Hi, everyone. This topic is acid, base, and water balance. It's kind of a short one and it's pretty straightforward. And there's even a little bit of fun problem solving at the end. So let's start by talking about fluid compartments. So we're made of pretty much 3/4 water. 75% water. But that water is not sort of just sloshing around everywhere inside of us, of course. It's divided into different compartments. Now, most of the water in our body is found inside cells. This is the ICF or intracellular fluid, and it accounts for about 65% of the water that's in our bodies. The rest of it is extracellular fluid or outside of the cells. And that includes interstitial fluid, which is the bulk of it, and which accounts for 25% of the water in the body. Plasma, which is the fluid in the vessels, which accounts for about 8% of the fluid in the body. And what's known as transcellular fluid, which is fluid that you find in the cerebrospinal fluid, or I'm suddenly blanking on other examples, but it's neither inside cells, between cells, or in the vessels. So what we're going to focus on today is actually the fluid in the plasma, because the plasma, as you know, is circulating around the body, which means that it's interacting with interstitial fluid everywhere in the body. And because that interstitial fluid is interacting with the cells, that means that any abnormal value in terms of pH or concentration of a particular ion, anything that's abnormal in the plasma has the ability to affect both the interstitial fluid and the cellular fluid. So let's take a look at plasma and in particular how the pH of the plasma is regulated. Okay, before we get started, I know some of you are probably a little rusty on pH. If you're not rusty on pH, then just forward this part of the video till we get to the next slide. For those of you that just need a little bit of a review, pH, the H in pH is actually referring to hydrogen ions known as protons. So pH is the concentration of these hydrogen ions, protons, in a solution. Now, why do we call hydrogen ions protons? Because they are. If we look at a hydrogen atom, and I know this is going way back in A&P here, you may recall that a hydrogen atom is made of a proton and an electron. So if we want to turn that hydrogen atom into an ion, a positively charged ion, then we're going to get rid of the electron. So now it's H plus, but if we remove this electron and its shell, all that's left is a proton. So that's why we call them protons. Now, the formula for calculating pH is that pH is equal to the negative log or logarithm of the concentration of protons. Whenever you see these square brackets and something inside, this means the concentration of whatever is inside those brackets. All right, so concentration of protons, that part makes sense. This negative log thing, though, that probably made your anxiety spike a little bit because who even understands what logarithms are? It's just a button on the calculator. But here's the thing, a logarithm is not incredibly complicated. It really just compresses or condenses the concentrations into a number scale that is manageable for humans. Let me show you what I mean. If we take the concentration of protons in the blood, which is measured at 0.00000001 molar, and we plug this concentration into this equation, then we end up with a pH of 7. Now, where does that 7 come from? If you look at where the decimal place is and you count how many times you have to move it before you get to a place where you've got a whole number, like the number 1 in this case, the number of times you move the decimal place is the same as the pH. Check it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. pH of 7. If we look at the concentration of protons in the stomach, which is 0.01 molar, and we count the number of decimal places, 1, 2, we have a pH of 2. If we look at the concentration of protons in the pancreas, which is 0.00, I can't even count all of those or say all of those. Let's just count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, pH of 12. Okay, so that allows us to condense these really awful numbers with tons of zeros into digits that are easy to communicate and recognize right away. That's the importance of the log. Okay, what that does though, especially the negative log part, is it means that the concentration of protons and the pH are inverse. If we look up here, this is the lowest concentration of protons that I gave in the examples, and it's got a high pH number. This is the highest concentration of protons, and it's got a low pH number. So one of the things that's tricky about dealing with pH is that you have to think in terms, you have to think about what you're saying in terms of the proton concentration. So when the pH goes down, your intuition says, oh, the protons must be going down, but that's not the case. When pH goes down, it actually means that the concentration of protons is going up. So they're opposite. The other thing that the logarithm does is it means that any change of one number or one digit on the pH scale represents a 10-fold change in pH, because each time the number changes, it means that we're moving the decimal one more place, which is a 10-fold change. So it may not seem like a lot for the pH of a substance to go from 7 to 8, but what that actually means is that the concentration of protons has increased 10-fold. Decreased. See, I just did it. Okay, so let's look at the pH scale. Those of you that have taken chemistry know that the pH scale can actually go beyond what I'm showing you here. But in terms of concentrations of protons that we're likely to see, we know that the pH scale goes from 1 to 14 or 0 to 14. 7, which is the pH of pure water, is what we call neutral. And anything that has more protons or a higher concentration of protons than water is considered an acid or acidic. And it ranges. Some things are a little acidic, some things are very acidic. Anything that has a lower concentration of protons is considered alkaline or basic. So we can have just a little bit less in terms of concentration, or we can have a lot less concentration. So that's our pH scale. Now, one of the things that you probably learned if you took chemistry is that acids and bases are defined as, or acids are defined as proton donors, and bases are defined as proton acceptors. Now, if you're like college age version of me, that definition doesn't make a lot of sense. So let me show you what it means. If we take as an example hydrochloric acid, which is a very strong acid, and we put it in water, that's what this arrow is representing. So hydrochloric acid on its own doesn't do anything. But if we put it in water, then the water molecules, because they are polar and because they form hydrogen bonds, they are going to separate the proton from the chloride, and they'll surround each one of those ions so that we're able to pull them apart. Well, what that means, if we're looking at the solution, is that suddenly, after adding HCl, suddenly we see more protons. So protons have been donated to the solution, and therefore this is an acid. Bases, on the other hand, are proton acceptors. This is a very strong base called sodium hydroxide. And when we put it in water, water does the same thing. It separates the ions. We have a sodium ion and a hydroxide ion. So we didn't get any more protons, so it's definitely not an acid, but we don't see any accepting going on here either. until this hydroxide ion combines with a free proton in solution, right? Because there's always free protons in solution. So these two, we've got negative, positive, they're super attracted to each other. They get close enough, they turn into a molecule of water. When this happens, then effectively this proton has disappeared from the solution. It has been accepted by something else. So when you put something in a solution or in water and protons disappear, then that means that you have a base. Okay, enough of the basics. Let's talk first. Actually, let me back up just a second here. What I'm going to talk about next is how we balance the pH in our blood. The first thing you need to know is that the range, the normal range for pH in blood is 7.35 to 7.45. So it's a very narrow range. Now, just like when you learned about pH in A&P1, we have these substances in our body that help to maintain the pH. So if the pH is here and I add acid to the solution, the pH is not going to change. That's because the body is using a buffer. So let's take a look at the different buffers. We have chemical buffer systems and we have physiological buffer systems. I'm going to start with the chemical. So one of the chemical buffer systems is known as the protein buffer system. Now, if you'll recall from A&P1, every protein is made of amino acids, and amino acids have a central carbon, a carboxyl group, and an amino group. The carboxyl group is sometimes in the form of COOH, like you see here, COOH. But if the solution that the protein is in needs more protons in order to have the right pH, then this proton, the one that's attached to this oxygen, can be let go. And the remaining amino acid just has the COO negative. Now, the amino group, the NH2 over here, does the opposite. So normally it's in the form of NH2, nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. But if a solution has extra protons, then this amino group is able to hold on to an extra. Shifts the charge, but it gets that proton out of the solution. So what this means is that between the two, whether there are extra protons or not enough protons, one way or the other, those amino acids are able to help balance out the pH and keep it stable. The bicarbonate buffer system uses a reversible chemical reaction that you've seen before and that you're probably going to be sick of by the time you reach the end of the course. But this relies on the relationship between carbon dioxide and protons in bicarbonate. So carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then splits and forms a bicarbonate and a proton. So each one of these can contribute to the pH. Now, this is a base and this is acid. So this will actually try to pull protons out unless we have, because of the law of mass action, a whole bunch of CO2, in which case we're just going to continue moving the reaction to the right and producing more protons. That may not make sense completely, but if you get the general idea, that's all you need. All right. We also have a phosphate buffer system. This is a phosphate, and phosphate is capable of taking on protons. So it can either take on 2 protons, or if the solution is really acidic, it can take on 3 protons. So it has a way to take those out of solution when there are too many. And if there aren't enough, then the reaction moves in the other direction to free up those protons and put them into solution. So all of these chemical buffers act immediately. As soon as the change in protons happens, these chemical buffers, the equations move one way or the other and get us back to balance. But the problem is that a buffer can only correct so much. If you think of a buffer as being like a sponge that soaks up extra protons, or if you squeeze it, can release some, a sponge can only hold so much water before it's saturated. The same thing is true for the chemical buffering systems in our body. So we need some extra help. This brings us to the physiological buffering systems. This is considered pH compensation. And there are two mechanisms in the body. One is the respiratory mechanism, your lungs, breathing, and the other is the renal mechanism, which involves the distal convoluted tubule that you just finished learning about in the urinary system. Let's take a look at the respiratory system first. The respiratory mechanism is fast but limited. So if I have a shift in pH, my body can actually begin to correct it by adjusting how much I'm breathing. But if I need to adjust my breathing down in order to correct the pH, there is a point at which you can't stop breathing. That would defeat the purpose of correcting the pH because you'd be dead. So your respiratory system, because it's also responsible for providing oxygen, cannot necessarily always fully correct a pH imbalance. What I want you to do now, as you're looking at this chemical reaction, is to equate carbon dioxide with acid. So if I have too much acid or too many protons in my body, then that's going to cause the law of mass action to push the reaction to the left, which generates more CO2. CO2 then can diffuse into the alveoli and be breathed out. If I don't have enough acid in my body, then we can keep the CO2 inside by depressing our breathing or depressing the ventilation, and that CO2 will turn into protons, which will help to restore the pH. So we breathe or ventilate more or less in order to adjust the CO2, which directly impacts the pH of the plasma. All right. Let's take a look at the renal mechanism. The renal mechanism is slower to fix problems than the respiratory mechanism, but it's more powerful because it's not trying to provide oxygen. It can just keep going and going and going. It doesn't have a limit. The part of the kidney that does this is the distal convoluted tubule in the nephron. And hopefully, as you know, the distal convoluted tubule has transporters for both protons and bicarbonate. So if this represents the tubule and this represents the blood, and the blood has too many protons, then the cells in the tubule are going to pull the protons out of the blood and they go to the urine, and it's going to put bicarbonate in the blood to help soak up some of those protons. In the opposite situation, where the concentration of protons in our blood is low, then that distal convoluted tubule can put protons into the blood and pull bicarbonate out, and the bicarbonate goes into the urine. So this is how the renal mechanism helps to correct pH. All right, let's take a look at the specific disorders. We're going to start with what's called acidosis. Osis means condition, so this word just means acidic condition. And it's defined as when the pH of the blood falls below 7.35, which is the low end of our normal range. Now, every pH disorder is either caused by something with the respiratory system, and is defined as a respiratory disorder, or it's defined as metabolic. So let's take a look at what that is. Respiratory acidosis. This means that the respiratory system is responsible for causing the problem. It can be due to anything that increases the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our body. What could that be? Hypoventilation, not breathing, holding your breath, diving and not getting up to the surface in time. The CO2 is building up and building up and building up because the metabolism in your body is continuing, but you're not getting enough of it out. So hypoventilation, COPDs, which you learned about in the respiratory system, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders, these are things that reduce exchange or the diffusion of gases across the membrane. So if at the same time that we have trouble getting the oxygen in, we also have trouble getting the carbon dioxide out. So it builds up in our body and causes acidosis. This can also be caused by restrictive pulmonary disorders. Remember that restrictive disorders are the ones that are like having something tight on your chest so that you can't expand your chest completely. So this could be like broken ribs because it just hurts to breathe, or it could be because you're pregnant or obese and the diaphragm can't move as easily to help with breathing. It could be because of scar tissue in your lungs. All of these are restrictive, but if you can't get those deep breaths and get the CO2 out, again, it builds up in your body. Also pulmonary edema, which is where fluid moves from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli. In that case, we've got now a layer of fluid that our gases have to travel through in order to exchange. That slows down diffusion, and that means that CO2 builds up. And remember that CO2, if we increase CO2, that's always going to give us protons. So extra CO2 means that it's becoming acidic. Let's take a look at metabolic acidosis. Metabolic really just means anything that's not respiratory. All right, so you can almost think of this as a miscellaneous category. It is diagnosed based on the level of bicarbonate that we have in the blood. So things that lead to metabolic acidosis. Increased production of acids like lactic acid when someone goes into shock and their body's not getting enough oxygen and therefore they use anaerobic fermentation to produce lactic acid. That leads to metabolic acidosis. Anyone that is dealing with starvation or diabetes where we can't get the sugar into the cells to use to make energy. And there's probably something else I can't think of. What the body relies on then is other fuel sources, and it produces keto acids. So one of the signs of diabetes that's untreated is actually called ketoacidosis. It means your body is producing these waste products that's throwing off your pH. Renal failure can lead to metabolic acidosis. That's because the distal convoluted tubule is not able to do its job of getting the protons out of the blood and putting them in the urine. Sepsis, which is a systemic bacterial infection, can cause this because bacteria often produce metabolic waste products that are acidic. Increased consumption of acids. Every once in a while, you'll see someone who takes way too much aspirin. Aspirin is salicylic acid, and that acid stays in the body and is difficult to get rid of and causes metabolic acidosis. Likewise, we can lose base. So someone with severe diarrhea is losing bicarbonate. Why? Because the pancreas, which produces bicarbonate, dumps it into the small intestine, which is part of what is lost when you have severe diarrhea. Losing base means that you've got too much acid. So these are the types of acidosis. Now, why is that bad? Let me tell you. So if we look at a cell where acidosis is just developing in the body, this is a neuron here. The high concentration of protons in the plasma and therefore in the interstitial space means that those protons are going to go to diffuse into our cells. Our cells want to maintain a particular charge. So in response, the potassium, which is also positively charged, the potassium leaves the cells so that we still have the correct resting membrane potential. The problem is that these protons, once they get in the cell, they bind to things, so they get buffered. And now we've lost those positive charges. That makes the inside of the cell extremely negative way more negative than usual. And this is called hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization means that we have to do more work to get to the threshold to trigger an action potential. It's like taking a pole vault and increasing the height of the pole that you're supposed to jump over. It just is harder to get there. And because of that, that means that electrically excitable cells like muscle and nerve are much harder to stimulate. And that means that our brain's not going to work, including the respiratory system. Our other muscles aren't going to work. We're going to be weak and lethargic, and eventually it can just completely stop breathing. Okay. Let's take a look at alkalosis. Alkalosis is when the blood pH rises above 7.45. In other words, we have a low concentration of protons. Just like we saw with acidosis, alkalosis can either be respiratory or metabolic. Respiratory alkalosis is caused by anything that leads to decreased carbon dioxide in the body. We don't have enough now to keep that acid around. This is caused by anything that causes hyperventilation. So this can be from anxiety. You can just, or it can be because you're climbing Mount Everest and you're not getting enough oxygen, and therefore you're breathing harder in order to get the oxygen, but you're also losing extra CO2. So it's messing up your pH. By the way, when you see somebody who is having an anxiety attack and breathing like that, you may know already that one of the things you can do is give them a paper bag to put over their nose and mouth. I used to think that was just to distract them from their anxiety, but once I went to school and learned all this stuff, I realized that what that's for is so that when you breathe the CO2 out, it goes into the bag and then you breathe it back in so you don't lose that CO2 and mess up the pH in your plasma. Okay, metabolic alkalosis is anything that's going to produce high bicarbonate. So, oops. Oh, this was supposed, overconsumption, this should say of antacids, not acids, I apologize. So antacids like Tums or Rolaids are actually just bicarbonate, usually calcium bicarbonate. So if you eat too many of those, then you're putting way too much bicarbonate in your body for your body to handle. You can also get metabolic alkalosis from a loss of acid. This is usually from severe vomiting or somebody that has to have their stomach pumped out because you're taking all that acid out of the body. It's meaning leaves a balance of bicarbonate or base in its place. Now, why is this bad? Same reason, but opposite. So in this case, because the proton concentration is so low out here, it causes the protons to leave the cell, and those are replaced by potassium ions. With all this extra potassium inside, the inside of the cell becomes more positive. And those protons that leave the cell get buffered outside the cell, which means that the outside becomes more negative. It's really kind of flipping the charge. It's causing depolarization, but not the kind that we want. So it will cause depolarization and you'll get one action potential. But because of this imbalance in charge, now you can't get the membrane potential to come back down so you can have another one. We're stuck. This means that first, the nerves and the muscles will be overstimulated because of the depolarization. So we'll have spasms, tetany, convulsions, and it will lead to paralysis and death. So these are serious disorders. This is something that gets monitored carefully. Let's take a look at how we diagnose these. This is the fun part, I think. So when we get these results back from a patient's blood lab, there are three things that we need in order to see whether they have an acid-base disorder and what's causing it. The pH, of course, the PCO2, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and bicarbonate. So the first step whenever you have these results is to look at the pH. In this case, the pH is higher than normal. And because it's higher than normal, we say that this is alkalosis. Now, at this point, we are done with the pH. You don't have to look at it again or even think about it again, really. We know this is alkalosis. Now, the next thing is to look at the PCO2 and the bicarbonate. Now, these are the normal ranges for those substances. You do not have to memorize these. If we look at PCO2, we can see that 42 is within the normal range. So this is okay. And in fact, when you're doing these, I recommend that you write normal or okay, so that you don't have to keep looking at the numbers and making the comparison. If we look at bicarbonate, which is 22 to 28 millimolar, this person has 37 millimolar. So this one is high. And so I just draw an arrow here. So PCO2 is normal, bicarbonate is high. Because the bicarbonate is high, we know that it is making the blood more basic or more alkaline. You can also think of this in terms of less acidic. So that since we know that the problem is that we have too much base and this is causing us to have too much base, now we know who to blame. We're going to blame the bicarbonate, and that means that we're going to call this a metabolic disorder. Any disorder that is caused by something that's wrong on this line is metabolic. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to know is the body compensating for it? You know, are the respiratory mechanism or renal mechanism working to fix the problem? So now we're going to look at the PCO2. Because it is normal, within normal range, that tells us that it's not doing extra to fix the problem. This person has uncompensated metabolic alkalosis. All right, let's take a look at another one. In this case, we have a pH that is lower than the normal range. So this tells us that it's acidosis. So we've identified that. Now we're going to look at the PCO2 and the bicarbonate. And if we compare them to the normal ranges, then we can see that both of them are elevated. And now you're thinking, well, if they're both wrong, then do I call it respiratory metabolic acidosis? No, you have to do one step further to figure out which one's actually causing the problem. So let's take a look. If CO2 is high, it is making the body more acidic. Remember, CO2 turns into acid. If bicarbonate is high, then it's making the body or the plasma more basic. So at this point, we have to go back and just remember what the pH is, or remember that it's acidosis. So if I have acidosis and there is something that is making me more acidic, then this is where I'm going to place the blame. It is not this, because this is making things more basic. You can think of it like this. You know, if you're sitting in a room and you've got an air conditioner on one side and a heater on the other, and they're both going, but you are feeling cold, you're not going to blame the heater. You're going to blame the air conditioner. In that same scenario, if you're feeling warm, you're not going to blame the air conditioner. You're going to blame the heater. So because our problem is too much acid, we're going to blame the substance that is making us more acidic. That means that this is respiratory acidosis. Okay. Now we have to figure out whether this is being compensated. So if we look at the other value, the one that's not causing the problem, we're going to check and see whether it is trying to correct the problem or if it's doing nothing at all. If this were normal, we would say it's not compensating. But because bicarbonate is high and because bicarbonate is making things more basic, in other words, bringing the pH back up from being too acidic, that means that our renal mechanism is working to get rid of the excess acid and is putting bicarbonate in the plasma to try and soak up some of the acid. So this person has respiratory acidosis that is compensated or being compensated. All right. That's pretty much it. The worksheet on this one, if you have trouble with this topic, is really helpful. It walks you through each of the steps. And of course, reach out to me if you have any confusion, and I'd be happy to work with you on it.